The rain wasn't just falling, it was a physical assault. It hammered the corrugated tin roof of the diner's back porch, a frantic drumbeat against the city's exhausted sigh. Jordan Hayes felt the spray on her cheeks as she heaved another black bag into the dumpster, the plastic slick and heavy in her grip. It was the last task of a 14-hour shift, the final punctuation on a day of sticky tables and lukewarm coffee. The alley was a canyon of wet brick and shimmering puddles, the air thick with the smell of rain on hot asphalt and old garbage. She was tired down to her bones, a deep, resonant ache that had become the background music of her life. She was about to turn, to retreat into the humid warmth of the kitchen, when a sound snagged her attention. It was small, a whimper swallowed almost immediately by a crash of thunder. Jordan froze, her hand on the rusted metal of the dumpster lid. She listened, holding her breath, telling herself it was just a stray cat, one of the legion of alley phantoms that haunted this part of the city. But the sound came again, clearer this time. It wasn't an animal. It was the sound of a child crying, a thin, terrified thread of sound in the storm's roaring tapestry. Her heart gave a painful lurch. She scanned the alley, her eyes tracing the deep shadows cast by the single, flickering security light. Nothing. Just the rain, the slick blacktop, the hulking shape of the dumpster. She took a hesitant step forward, her worn-out sneakers squelching in a puddle. "Hello," she called out, her voice feeling small and foolish against the storm. Silence answered. The rain fell harder, plastering a strand of dark hair to her forehead. She almost dismissed it, almost let the weariness win. But the memory of that sound, so full of raw fear, held her in place. She moved toward the dumpster, her every instinct screaming at her to go back inside, lock the door, and forget what she'd heard. Alleyways after midnight were not places for curiosity. She peered behind the massive metal bin, into the deepest part of the shadows where the light couldn't reach. And she saw them. Two small figures, huddled together against the grimy brick wall, trying to make themselves invisible. A boy and a girl, their faces pale smudges in the gloom. The boy had his arm wrapped tightly around the girl, his small body a shield against the world. He couldn't have been more than 9. The girl, maybe 7. They were drenched, filthy, their clothes torn and stained with things Jordan didn't want to identify. But it was their eyes that stopped her breath. They were huge, dark with a terror so profound it seemed ancient, a fear no child should ever know. "Hey," Jordan said, her voice impossibly soft. She knelt, ignoring the foul water soaking through the knees of her jeans. She held her hands out, palms up, a universal sign of peace she hoped they would understand. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The boy flinched, pulling the little girl closer. He stared at Jordan with an unnerving intensity, his small jaw set in a defiant line. He was protecting her. Even here, in this nightmare, he was her guardian. "We saw bad men," he whispered, his voice raspy and cracked. "They took us. We ran." The little girl buried her face in her brother's shoulder and began to sob, a heart-wrenching, silent shaking that spoke of a terror beyond tears. Jordan's own heart fractured. The weariness, the aches, the 14-hour shift, it all evaporated, replaced by a surge of something fierce and protective, a feeling she hadn't known she was capable of. "Okay," she said, her voice steady and calm, a rock in the storm. "Okay. The bad men are gone now. You're safe with me." She looked from the boy's defiant eyes to the girl's trembling form. They were starving. She could see it in the hollows of their cheeks, the desperate way they clung to each other as if for sustenance. "Are you hungry?" The boy gave a single, jerky nod, his gaze never leaving her face. He was assessing her, weighing the risk. "I have a place," Jordan said. "It's warm. It's dry. I have food. You can come with me. I promise, I will keep you safe." She didn't know where the words came from. She lived in a cramped basement apartment 3 blocks away, a place where the pipes rattled and the upstairs neighbors fought. She had $73 to her name until her next paycheck. She had nothing to offer them, nothing but a promise forged in a dark alley behind a dumpster. But as she looked at them, at their fragile bodies and old, haunted eyes, she knew it was a promise she would die to keep. The boy watched her for a long, silent moment. The thunder rolled again, and the little girl whimpered, a sound of pure misery. That seemed to decide it. He gave another small nod. "My name is Jordan," she said, offering a small, tremulous smile. "What are your names?" The boy hesitated, his gaze flickering down to his sister before returning to Jordan. "I'm Matthias," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "This is Freya." Matthias and Freya, Jordan repeated, the names feeling solid and real in the chaotic night. "It's very nice to meet you. Let's get you out of this rain." She stood slowly, extending a hand. Matthias watched it for a second, then, with a courage that stunned her, he reached out and took it. His hand was tiny, icy cold, and trembling, but his grip was surprisingly firm. With her other hand, she gently touched Freya's shoulder. The little girl flinched but didn't pull away. And so, hand in hand, the three of them walked out of the alley, leaving the roaring storm behind them, stepping into a new and uncertain world together. Jordan's small apartment had never felt so much like a sanctuary. It was more than a place with a leaky faucet and a lumpy mattress. For 3 days, it became a fortress. The first order of business was a bath. The water ran brown at first, washing away layers of grime and fear. Jordan had to cut away swaths of Freya's beautiful, tangled blonde hair where burrs and something sticky had matted it into knots. The little girl sat silently in the tub, her small body rigid, her eyes fixed on the peeling paint of the bathroom wall. Matthias stood guard by the door, refusing to leave her side, his posture that of a soldier 10 times his age. Jordan's heart ached with every gentle pass of the washcloth. She found bruises on their arms and knees, and a long, ugly scratch on Matthias's back. She didn't ask. She just cleaned them, wrapped them in her own softest, biggest towels, and dressed them in old t-shirts that hung on their thin frames like gowns. Food was next. Grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. It was all she had, but to them, it might as well have been a feast. They ate with a desperate, silent hunger that was painful to watch. Matthias ate quickly, his eyes darting around the room, but Freya took small, hesitant bites, as if she expected the food to be snatched away at any moment. Jordan just sat with them at her rickety kitchen table, not speaking, letting the simple act of eating in a warm, safe place be its own comfort. When they were finished, Freya's eyelids began to droop. Jordan made them a bed on her lumpy sofa, piling it with every blanket and pillow she owned. She tucked them in, a gesture that felt both alien and deeply natural. As she pulled the quilt up to Freya's chin, the little girl's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Don't leave," Freya whispered, her voice thick with sleep and fear. "I won't," Jordan promised, her voice catching in her throat. "I'll be right here." She settled into the armchair across from the sofa, the one with the springs that poked you if you sat wrong, and she watched them. Matthias fought sleep for a long time, his eyes scanning the darkened room, but eventually, exhaustion won. He curled into a tight ball, his hand still resting on his sister's arm, a protector even in his dreams. Jordan watched them breathe, the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of their small chests, and a fierce, unfamiliar love bloomed in her chest. They were hers now. She didn't know how, or for how long, but in that moment, they were her kids. The next 3 days passed in a strange, suspended reality. Jordan called in sick to work, a risk she couldn't afford but didn't hesitate to take. The world shrank to the 4 walls of her apartment. She and the children existed in a quiet bubble of healing. They didn't talk about the bad men, or where they came from. Instead, they built pillow forts and read stories from the one book of fairy tales Jordan had owned since she was a child. Freya, it turned out, had a quiet, sunny smile that transformed her whole face. She began to follow Jordan around the apartment, a silent, blonde shadow. Matthias remained watchful, but slowly, the tension in his shoulders began to ease. He even laughed once, a real, startling bark of a laugh, when Jordan slipped on a stray sock and landed ungracemoniously on her butt. It was in these small moments that they became a family. Jordan learned that Matthias was fiercely intelligent, with a solemn curiosity about how things worked, and that Freya loved to draw, filling pages of notebook paper with colorful, wobbly flowers and suns. She learned the specific cadence of their breathing as they slept, the exact pitch of Freya's sigh when she was content. They learned that Jordan made the best pancakes, that she hummed off-key when she was washing dishes, and that her hugs were warm and safe. On the third night, a different kind of storm broke. It wasn't rain this time, but a frantic, pounding knock on her apartment door. It was late, well after midnight. Jordan's blood ran cold. She had been living on borrowed time, and she knew it. She motioned for the children, who were asleep on the sofa, to be quiet, her finger to her lips. Their eyes flew open, the old fear instantly returning. She herded them into her small bedroom and closed the door, whispering, "Stay here. Don't make a sound." The pounding came again, louder this time, a heavy, insistent summons that rattled the cheap wood in its frame. This wasn't the police. This was something else. Her hand closed around the old wooden baseball bat she kept propped in the corner. It felt flimsy, ridiculous, but it was all she had. She crept to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She peered through the peephole, her breath catching in her throat. Standing in the dimly lit hallway of her building was a man. He was impossibly tall, dressed in a long, black coat that seemed to drink the light. His hair was as black as a moonless night, and his face was all sharp angles and severe, breathtaking beauty. He looked like something out of one of her fairy tale books, a dark king from a forgotten land. But it was his eyes that held her paralyzed. They were the color of twilight, and they were fixed on her door with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. He knew she was in there. He knew she had the children. "Open the door," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the wood, a low, resonant command that vibrated in her bones. It was a voice accustomed to absolute obedience. Jordan's fear was a cold, metallic taste in her mouth, but the image of Matthias and Freya, huddled in her bedroom, ignited something hotter and stronger. She gripped the baseball bat tighter, planting her feet. "Go away," she called out, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "Or I'm calling the cops." A low, humorless chuckle came from the other side. "I assure you, madam, the local authorities will be of no assistance to you. You have something that belongs to me. I have come to collect it." "I don't have anything that belongs to you," she lied, her knuckles white on the bat. "Do not play games with me." The voice dropped, losing its veneer of civility, replaced by a cold, lethal edge. "I have been searching for 3 days. My patience is at an end. Give me my children. My children." The words slammed into her. This man, this terrifying, beautiful creature, was their father. He was one of the bad men? No. Matthias had said the men took them. They had run from them. But this man, he didn't feel like a kidnapper. He felt like a reckoning. She didn't answer. She couldn't. She just stood there, a 24-year-old waitress with a baseball bat, preparing to face down a king. There was a moment of profound silence, and then a sound that made her flinch, the soft click of the lock turning. He hadn't broken it, he had simply opened it. The door swung inward with a slow, deliberate groan. He stood on her threshold, and the small, dingy hallway seemed to shrink around him. He was even larger up close, a figure of overwhelming power and authority. His twilight eyes swept the room, taking in the lumpy sofa, the flickering lamp, the general state of her worn-out life, before they settled on her. They were ancient eyes, filled with a sorrow and a fury that made her want to weep. "Where are they?" he demanded, his voice a quiet storm. Jordan didn't flinch. She raised the bat, holding it between them. It was a pathetic shield, but it was hers. "You're not taking them," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I don't know who you are, or what you want with them, but they're staying with me. They're safe here." For the first time, a flicker of something other than anger crossed his face. Surprise. Disbelief. He stared at her, at the cheap wooden bat, at the fierce, terrified defiance in her eyes. He took a step into the room. "Get out," she warned, her arms trembling with the effort of holding the bat steady. He ignored her, his gaze sweeping toward the closed bedroom door. "Matthias." "Freya," he called, and his voice changed. The iron command was gone, replaced by a raw, aching vulnerability that stunned her. It was the sound of a father's heart breaking. And from behind the door, she heard it. A small, choked gasp. The door creaked open, and Matthias stood there, his small face pale. He stared at the man in the doorway, his eyes wide. Then, Freya peeked out from behind him. The change was instantaneous. The fear in their eyes didn't deepen, it dissolved. It was replaced by a wave of relief so powerful it was almost a visible thing. "Papa!" Freya cried, her voice a sob of pure joy. She launched herself from the doorway, a small, blonde missile, and ran straight past Jordan, straight to the terrifying man. He knelt, catching her in his arms, burying his face in her hair. His entire massive frame seemed to shudder with the force of his relief. Matthias was right behind her, his small arms wrapping around the man's neck, his face pressed into his father's shoulder. "Papa, we were so scared," Matthias whispered, his voice muffled. "I know," the man murmured, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I know, my son. I have you now. You are safe. You are both safe." Jordan stood frozen, the baseball bat suddenly feeling impossibly heavy in her hands. It sagged, its tip dipping toward the floor. Her mind reeled. This wasn't a monster. This wasn't a bad man. This was their father. This was Papa. The fierce, protective wall she had built around her heart and her apartment crumbled to dust. She was just a waitress, standing in her socks, holding a baseball bat, and she had just threatened a king who was searching for his lost children. The bat slipped from her numb fingers and clattered onto the cheap linoleum floor. The sound was loud, final, and utterly pathetic. Theron Nightshade, king of the vast and shadowed territories that bordered the mortal world, did not let go of his children. He held them, his arms wrapped around their small, trembling bodies, anchoring himself to their warmth, their scent, the simple, miraculous fact of their existence. For 3 days and 3 nights, his world had been a cold, silent hell. His every tracker, his every soldier, his every ounce of power had been bent to a single purpose: finding them. He had followed a trail of fading fear and desperate hope, a trail that had inexplicably led him to this, a crumbling brick building in a human city, and a basement apartment that smelled of cinnamon and dust. When he had finally located their presence behind this door, his rage had been a physical force, a storm contained behind his ribs. He had imagined some craven opportunist, some monster who had stolen his heirs for ransom or for some darker purpose. He had been prepared to tear the world apart to get them back. What he had not been prepared for was her. The woman. Jordan. He slowly raised his head, his gaze lifting from his daughter's tangled hair to the woman standing frozen in the middle of the room. She was small, unassuming, dressed in worn clothing that spoke of a life of struggle. And yet, she had stood against him. She had faced him down, a god-king whose name was whispered in fear across continents, with nothing but a piece of wood and a heart full of impossible courage. She hadn't been trying to harm his children, she had been trying to protect them. From him. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it struck him silent. In his world, people bowed. They scraped. They trembled. They did not stand on their own 2 feet and deny him anything, let alone the return of his own blood. He looked from her wide, shocked eyes to the baseball bat lying on the floor. A warrior's heart in the body of a waitress. "You," he said, his voice softer now, stripped of its fury and filled with a dawning awe. "You are the one who found them." Jordan could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She watched as he gently stroked Freya's hair, his large, elegant hands impossibly tender. He murmured something to Matthias in a language she didn't understand, a soft, lyrical string of sounds that made the boy's shoulders relax completely for the first time in 3 days. "They were behind the diner where I work," she finally managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "Hiding from the storm. They were scared. And hungry." Theron's gaze met hers over the top of Freya's head. There was no anger in his eyes now, only a profound, soul-deep gratitude that was more overwhelming than his rage had been. "You fed them," he stated. "It wasn't a question." "I made them grilled cheese," she said, feeling foolish. "You gave them shelter," he continued, his eyes taking in the pile of blankets on the sofa. "You kept them warm. It was cold out. You kept them safe," he finished, his voice resonating with the weight of the words. "When you believed I was a threat, you were prepared to defend them from me." With that he gestured with his chin toward the bat. Jordan's cheeks flushed. "I thought, they said bad men. I thought you might be one of them. The men who took them will be dealt with in a manner that will ensure they never threaten anyone again," Theron said, a sliver of the earlier coldness returning to his voice. It was a promise of brutal, absolute justice. But you did what my entire royal guard could not. You found them. And you protected them. He finally, reluctantly, eased his hold on the children. Matthias, Freya. This is Jordan. She is the one who was brave enough to help you. Freya turned her head, her cheek still pressed against her father's coat. She looked at Jordan, her blue eyes clear and trusting. Jordan gave me a bath, she said softly. And she read me the story about the princess and the frog. Matthias nodded, his expression solemn. She makes the best pancakes, he added, a statement of high praise. Theron listened to them, and a slow, unreadable expression softened the severe lines of his face. He looked back at Jordan, truly seeing her for the first time. Not as an obstacle, not as a human, but as the person who had cared for the two halves of his heart when he could not. I am in your debt, he said, the words formal but imbued with a sincerity that was absolute. A debt of this magnitude cannot be repaid with gold. But I must try. He paused, his mind clearly working. You cannot stay here. Those who betrayed me may know this place was the end of the trail. You would not be safe. Jordan's own safety hadn't even occurred to her. I don't have anywhere else to go. Yes, you do, Theron said, a decision solidifying in his gaze. You will come with us. To the palace. Jordan stared at him, dumbfounded. The palace? You are under my protection now, he stated, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. And I find myself in need of someone who possesses your particular instincts. Someone who sees a threat and does not hesitate. My children are fond of you. They trust you. I am offering you a position. You will look after them. You will have quarters, you will be provided for, and you will have the gratitude of your king. It wasn't a request. It was a royal decree, delivered in a basement apartment that smelled of stale coffee. Jordan's head was spinning. A king. A palace. It was insane. It was impossible. But then she looked at Matthias and Freya, who were now watching her with wide, hopeful eyes. Freya reached out a small hand toward her. Please come with us, Jordan, she whispered. And in that moment, Jordan knew she had no choice. Her world had tilted on its axis the moment she'd heard a whimper behind a dumpster. Her life of lonely shifts and rattling pipes was over. She didn't know what lay ahead, in this impossible, fairy-tale world of kings and palaces. She only knew that she could not, would not, leave these children. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of ozone and destiny. She looked at the Dark King, at his powerful form and his ancient, grateful eyes. And she gave a single nod. Okay, she said. I'll come. The transition from her world to his was less of a step and more of a seismic schism. One moment, she was standing in her dingy apartment, the next, she was in the back of a car so sleek and silent it felt more like a vessel from another dimension. It moved through the city streets like a ghost, its windows tinted so dark that the familiar world outside seemed like a distant, faded film. Matthias and Freya sat on either side of her, their small bodies pressed close, as if she were the fixed point in their reeling universe. Theron sat opposite them, a figure of still, quiet power, his gaze fixed on the blur of city lights. They did not drive for long. The car turned down a street Jordan had never seen, though it was in the heart of the city, and passed through a set of wrought iron gates that seemed to materialize out of the shadows. And then she saw it. The palace wasn't a building, it was a defiance of architecture, a fortress of black stone and shimmering glass that clawed at the night sky. It was both ancient and brutally modern, a place of impossible contradictions. It didn't belong in her world, and yet here it was, hidden in plain sight. Inside, the scale of it was meant to diminish. Ceilings soared into darkness, supported by columns of polished obsidian. The floors were black marble, so reflective they seemed to hold a starless sky beneath her feet. The air was cool and still, scented with something like old stone, night-blooming flowers, and power. Guards in dark, immaculate uniforms stood like statues in the echoing halls, their faces impassive, their eyes missing nothing. They bowed their heads as Theron passed, a silent, synchronized ripple of deference. Jordan felt impossibly small, out of place in her jeans and faded t-shirt. She clutched the single, pathetic bag she'd packed, a change of clothes, her toothbrush, the worn copy of her fairytale book. Theron led them to a wing of the palace that felt marginally less intimidating. The corridors were still vast, but they were carpeted in thick, dark rugs that muffled their footsteps, and the walls were hung with tapestries depicting star charts and ancient battles. He stopped before a set of carved wooden doors. "These will be your quarters," he said, pushing them open. "They are connected to the children's." Jordan stepped inside and her breath caught. The room was larger than her entire apartment. A fire crackled in a massive stone hearth, casting a warm, dancing light over a plush sitting area. A canopied bed piled high with pillows and furs stood against one wall. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out onto a sprawling, moonlit garden. It was the most beautiful room she had ever seen. She started, but no words came. "It is sufficient, I hope," Theron said, a hint of something unreadable in his tone. Freya tugged on Jordan's hand. "Our room is next door. Come see." The children's suite was just as grand, but filled with the comfortable clutter of their lives. Books were stacked on tables, a half-finished model of a castle sat on a desk, and drawings, Freya's wobbly flowers and suns, were taped to one of the walls. It was a space of opulent warmth, a gilded cage made into a home. A stern-looking woman in a severe grey dress appeared, her face a mask of disapproval as her eyes swept over Jordan. "Your Majesty. The children are prepared for bed." "Thank you, Ilara," Theron said, his voice formal. "That will be all. Jordan will see to them tonight." The woman's eyebrows shot up, a flicker of outrage crossing her features before she smoothed it away. She gave Jordan a look of profound disdain, then bowed stiffly and departed. The dismissal was clear. Jordan was an interloper, a stray brought in from the streets. The social hierarchy of this place was a palpable thing, a wall she had just run into. But the children didn't seem to notice. They immediately turned to Jordan, their expectations clear. The routine they had established in her tiny apartment was now to be performed here, in this grand new setting. So Jordan did what she knew how to do. She helped them change into their soft pajamas. She listened as Matthias explained the complex lineage of the kings depicted in a portrait, and she sat on the edge of Freya's bed and opened her worn book of fairy tales. Theron stood in the doorway, watching. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just watched as she read the familiar story of the princess and the frog, her voice soft and steady in the quiet room. He watched as Freya's eyelids grew heavy and as Matthias, pretending to be too old for such things, listened intently from his own bed. He watched as she tucked them in, her movements gentle and sure, whispering goodnight and promising to be right in the next room. When she finally turned and saw him there, a silent shadow in the opulent doorway, she felt a jolt of awareness. They were alone. The children were asleep. The palace was quiet. "They have never taken to a stranger like that," he said, his voice a low murmur. "The nannies, the tutors, they are staff. To them, you are something else." "I'm not a stranger," Jordan replied softly. "Not anymore." He nodded, accepting this simple truth. "The captain of my guard, Valerus, will wish to speak with you tomorrow. He will have questions about what you saw. What the children told you." "They didn't say much," Jordan said. "Just bad men and that they ran. Anything you can remember, no matter how small, could be useful." His expression hardened. "There was a traitor. One of my own. Someone who lowered the wards and allowed the kidnappers access. I will find them." The venom in his voice was chilling. This wasn't just a king seeking justice, it was a father hunting the person who had endangered his children. "I'll tell him everything I know," she promised. He held her gaze for a long moment, his twilight eyes searching her face. "You are not afraid of me," he observed. It was not a question. "I was," she admitted honestly. "When you were at my door, I was terrified. But you're not the one I should be afraid of." A faint, almost imperceptible softening occurred around his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. "Get some rest, Jordan," he said. "You have earned it." He turned and walked away, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. Jordan stood there for a long time, the warmth of the children's room at her back and the vast, cold opulence of the palace stretching out before her. She had been brought here to be a caretaker, a glorified nanny. But as she listened to the quiet breathing of the sleeping children, she knew her role was something more. She was their shield. And in a palace full of shadows and secrets, she had a sinking feeling they were going to need one. The next morning, Jordan learned that life in a palace was a series of quiet rituals and unspoken rules. Servants moved with silent efficiency, their faces blank masks of professionalism. They brought her a breakfast tray laden with foods she couldn't name and laid out a selection of simple but elegant dresses, a clear, unspoken message about the inadequacy of her own wardrobe. She chose a plain, dark blue dress that felt the least like a costume and went to wake the children. They were already awake, waiting for her. The fear of the past few days had been replaced by a subdued energy. This was their home, their normal. But they still clung to her, a small island of familiarity in the wake of their trauma. Later that morning, she met the captain of the guard. Waitress was a stark contrast to his king. Where Theron was dark and imposing, Waitress was fair-haired, his features almost too perfect, like a statue carved from pale marble. His eyes, however, were a sharp, intelligent blue, and they missed nothing. He was courteous, his manners impeccable, but there was a coldness to him, a professional distance that felt absolute. They sat in a vast, sunlit library, the air thick with the scent of old paper and leather. The children were with their tutors, and the silence felt heavy. "Tell me everything," Waitress began, his voice calm and even. "From the moment you found them." Jordan recounted the story, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. She described the alley, the storm, the state of their clothes, the fear in their eyes. She told him the few words Matthias had spoken. "Bad men, they took us, we ran." Waitress listened intently, his fingers steepled before him. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "The prince said bad men, plural," he asked, his sharp gaze pinning her. "Yes," Jordan confirmed. "That's what he said." "Interesting," Waitress murmured, more to himself than to her. The initial report from the breach suggested a single operative. He made a note on a piece of parchment. "And they said nothing else? No names? No descriptions of the men, or the place they were taken?" "Nothing," Jordan said. "I didn't want to push them. They were terrified." Waitress's lips thinned into a tight line. "Their emotional state is secondary to the security of the kingdom, madam. A weakness in our defenses has been exposed. It must be rectified." His coldness bristled against her protective instincts. "They're children," she snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. "They're not security assets." For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Waitress's face, a flash of irritation. "You are new here. You do not understand how things work. The prince and princess are the future of the kingdom. Their safety is paramount. Above all else." "I think I understand that better than anyone," Jordan shot back, thinking of the baseball bat and the terrifying figure in her doorway. Their tense standoff was interrupted by the library doors swinging open. Theron entered, his presence instantly commanding the space. He took in the scene, Jordan's flushed, angry face, Waitress's rigid posture, and his eyebrows drew together in a faint frown. "Is there a problem, Captain?" he asked, his voice deceptively mild. "No, Your Majesty," Waitress said, rising to his feet. "I was merely concluding my interview. The witness has provided limited information." The subtle emphasis was a clear dismissal of her value. "Jordan is not a witness, Captain," Theron corrected him, his voice dropping a degree. "She is a member of my household and the children's personal guardian. You will afford her the appropriate respect." Waitress's jaw tightened, but he inclined his head. "Of course, Your Majesty." He turned to Jordan. "My apologies if my manner was abrupt. These are trying times." It was not an apology, and they all knew it. Jordan merely nodded, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a verbal response. With another bow to the king, Waitress departed, his footsteps crisp and military on the marble floor. "He doesn't like me very much," Jordan stated quietly, once he was gone. "Waitress is a man of order and protocol," Theron replied, walking over to one of the towering bookshelves. "You are an anomaly. You disrupt his carefully structured world." He ran a finger along the spine of a leather-bound book. He is the finest soldier I have ever known. His loyalty is beyond question. There was a finality in his tone that suggested the topic was closed. But something about Valerus bothered Jordan. It was the way he'd dismissed her, the coldness in his eyes when he spoke of the children. It was more than just a soldier's pragmatism. It felt wrong. She remembered the look on Alara the nanny's face, the stiff formality of the guards. She was an outsider here, and the palace's immune system was already trying to reject her. In the days that followed, Jordan's life settled into a new, surreal rhythm. Her duties were simple. She was with the children. She woke them, ate with them, sat with them during their lessons with tutors who treated her with polite condescension, and put them to bed with a story from her book. She was their constant, their anchor. The nightmares started a week after their return. Jordan was woken by a scream, a raw, terrified sound that ripped through the silence of the night. She was out of bed and through the connecting door in an instant. Matthias was sitting bolt upright in his bed, his face pale in the moonlight, his breathing coming in ragged gasps. They were coming back, he choked out as she sat on the edge of his bed, gathering him into her arms. The bad men. I couldn't run fast enough. She held him, rocking him gently, murmuring the same soothing nonsense she had in her apartment. It was just a dream. You're safe now. You're home. Nobody can get you here. The door to the corridor opened, and Theron stood there, drawn by the sound. He was dressed in simple black trousers and a loose shirt, his hair slightly disheveled from sleep. He looked less like a king and more like a worried father. He came and sat on the other side of the bed, his large hand resting on his son's back. I am here, Matthias, he said, his voice a low rumble. Jordan is here. You are protected. Together, they calmed him. Jordan continued to hold him while Theron spoke to him in their melodic language, his words a soothing balm. Eventually, Matthias's trembling subsided, and he sank back against the pillows, his eyes closing, one hand still clutching Jordan's sleeve. They sat there in the silence, two guardians watching over a sleeping child. This is the third time this week, Theron said, his voice tight with a pain he tried to conceal. The healers say it will take time. Of course it will, Jordan said softly. They went through something horrible. You can't just expect them to forget it. He looked at her, his expression shadowed and complex in the dim light. You are good with them. You have a stillness. It calms them. I just treat them like kids, she said with a shrug. I think maybe they need that more than they need princes and princesses right now. A long silence stretched between them. He never cried before, Theron said, his voice barely a whisper. Even as a small child. He always believed he had to be strong. For Freya. For the kingdom. He looked at his son's sleeping face, a universe of love and sorrow in his eyes. You have given him permission to be a child. The raw vulnerability in his voice touched something deep inside her. In this moment, he wasn't a king. He was just a father, terrified and grateful and utterly lost. They're good kids, she said, because it was the only thing she could think of to say. They are, he agreed. He rose from the bed. Thank you, Jordan. It's my job, she said. No, he corrected her, his gaze intense. This is not a job. Not for you. It is something more. He left as silently as he had come, leaving Jordan sitting in the moonlight, the warmth of a small boy's hand on her arm and the weight of a lonely king's gratitude settling around her shoulders. She was beginning to understand that the palace's secrets were not just about traitors and politics. They were about the quiet, hidden heartaches of the family that lived within its walls. And she was no longer on the outside looking in. She was right in the center of it. Jordan's street-smart instincts, honed by years of reading customers and navigating the subtle threats of city life, were ill-suited to the rigid protocols of the palace. But they gave her a different kind of sight. While the guards saw order and the servants saw duty, Jordan saw the small, telling details of human behavior. She noticed the way a footman's eyes would flicker toward a certain corridor when he thought no one was watching. She noticed how Alara, the head nanny, would speak of the children's ordeal with a strange, almost clinical detachment. And she noticed that Captain Valerus, for all his talk of paramount safety, never once looked the children in the eye. He would address them through their father, or through her. He would inquire after their well-being with perfect, cold courtesy, but his gaze would always be directed slightly above their heads, as if they were abstract concepts of royalty rather than two small, traumatized children. It was a small thing, a tiny crack in his perfect, polished facade, but it bothered her. A man in charge of protecting children should, at the very least, be able to look at them. One afternoon, she was in the gardens with Freya, who was meticulously drawing a portrait of a rosebush. Jordan was watching her, a soft smile on her face, when she saw Werewolves striding down a nearby path. He was on his way to the training grounds, his posture ramrod straight. As he passed, Freya looked up. "Good afternoon, Captain Werewolves," she said, her small voice polite and clear, just as her tutors had instructed. Werewolves stopped. He turned his head, his body remaining perfectly aligned toward his destination. "Good afternoon, Your Highness," he replied, his voice flat. His eyes, for a single, fleeting second, met Freya's. And in that second, Jordan saw it. It wasn't coldness or indifference. It was a flicker of visceral dislike, a flash of pure, unadulterated resentment, gone as quickly as it appeared. He gave a curt nod and continued on his way without another word. Freya's face fell. She looked down at her drawing, her lip trembling slightly. "The captain doesn't like me," she whispered. "That's not true, sweetie," Jordan said, kneeling beside her, though a cold knot was forming in her stomach. "He's just a very serious man." But she knew it was a lie. What she had seen in his eyes was real. It was the missing piece, the thing that hadn't made sense. Why would the captain of the Royal Guard, a man sworn to protect the royal family, resent a 7-year-old girl? That evening, after the children were asleep, Jordan couldn't rest. The image of that look, that flash of hatred, was burned into her mind. She paced the length of her luxurious room, a cage of silk and stone. Theron's words echoed in her head, "His loyalty is beyond question." But loyalty to what? To the king? Or to the idea of the kingdom? She needed to know more. She slipped out of her room and made her way to the one place she thought she might find answers, the library. The massive room was empty at this hour, lit only by a few low lamps that cast long, dancing shadows. She didn't know what she was looking for. A history book? A record of the Royal Guard? She ran her fingers along the spines, the titles a litany of wars, treaties, and lineages. It was overwhelming. She was a waitress, not a scholar. What was she even doing? "You are looking for something." Theron's voice came from the shadows, and Jordan jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. He emerged from a darkened alcove, a half-empty glass of some dark liquid in his hand. He had been watching her. I couldn't sleep," she stammered. "Nor I," he said, his gaze heavy. He gestured to a chair opposite the one he had been sitting in. "Join me." Hesitantly, she sat. The silence between them was thick with unspoken things. "What troubles you, Jordan?" he asked, his voice low and intimate in the vast, quiet room. She took a breath. "It's Werewolves." Theron's expression didn't change, but a stillness came over him. "Go on." "I saw the way he looked at Freya today in the garden," she said, the words tumbling out. "It wasn't just professional. He hates her. I saw it in his eyes." Theron was silent for a long time, swirling the dark liquid in his glass. "Werewolves' family has served mine for centuries," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "His father was my father's most trusted captain. Werewolves grew up in this palace. He and I were raised as brothers." "That doesn't mean anything," Jordan insisted. "People change. Something is wrong. You are making a grave accusation based on a look," he said, his tone a quiet warning. "I know what I saw," she said, her own voice rising with conviction. "And there's something else. When I talked to him, he said the initial report suggested a single operative. But Matthias said bad men plural. Why would the report be wrong?" Theron set his glass down, the soft click of crystal on wood echoing in the silence. He stared at her, his twilight eyes narrowed in thought. He was re-evaluating, running her observations through the filter of his own knowledge. "The report was based on the magical signature left at the breach," he explained slowly. "It was faint, but it indicated a single caster. It is possible they had mortal accomplices. Or the report was falsified, Jordan countered. By the person who wrote it. By the person who was first on the scene. Who would that have been? His eyes met hers, and in them, she saw the dawning of a terrible understanding. The captain of the guard, he whispered. The weight of that possibility settled between them, heavy and suffocating. The man he considered a brother. The man whose loyalty was beyond question. Why? Jordan asked, the question hanging in the air. Why would he do it? Why would he hate Freya? Theron looked away, his gaze fixed on the darkness outside the library window. A deep, weary sadness settled over his features. Valerus was not the only one I considered a brother. I had an elder brother, Malachi. He was the heir. Valerus's sister, Lyra, was betrothed to him from birth. Their union was meant to solidify the two oldest families in the kingdom. He paused, the memories clearly painful. But Malachi was reckless, ambitious. He dabbled in forbidden arts. He believed our kingdom should rule over the mortal realm, not hide from it. My father exiled him. Malachi swore revenge. He was killed years later, trying to lead an insurrection against the throne. He took a deep breath. Lyra was devastated. She never recovered. She faded, and died a few years later. Valerus blamed my father. He blamed me, for not speaking up for my brother, for upholding the exile when I became king. He believes I stole his sister's future, and his family's rightful place at the side of the throne. The pieces clicked into place, forming a dark and ugly picture. So he hates your children, Jordan breathed, horrified. Because they represent the line that continued, while his died out. He would see it as a perversion of the true bloodline, Theron said, his voice grim. In his mind, Matthias and Freya are usurpers, sitting on a throne that should have belonged to Malachi's heirs. To his own nephews and nieces. It was a motive born of grief, twisted by ambition and years of silent resentment. It was the kind of poison that could rot a man from the inside out. What do we do? Jordan asked. Theron turned from the window, his face a mask of cold fury. The sad, weary father was gone, replaced by the king. We do not have enough for a direct accusation. He is too respected, too powerful. A direct challenge without irrefutable proof would split the court, perhaps even the military. He would use it to paint me as a paranoid tyrant. He looked at Jordan, a new and dangerous light in his eyes. So we will let him expose himself. He thinks you are a foolish, insignificant human. An irritant. He will underestimate you. And that will be his undoing. In that moment, Jordan understood. Theron hadn't just brought her to the palace to be a nanny. He had seen the steel in her, the warrior's heart that had faced him down with a baseball bat. He was giving her a new weapon and a new purpose. She was no longer just the children's shield. She was the king's agent, a spy hidden in plain sight, and her battlefield was the treacherous, whispering corridors of the royal palace. The plan was simple, and its simplicity was its danger. Jordan was to be bait. Theron began to show her favor, a subtle but noticeable shift in the palace dynamics. He requested her presence at his private dinners with the children, he walked with her in the gardens, he asked for her opinion on matters concerning the household. To an outside observer, it would look as though the king was becoming personally attached to the human nanny. To Valerus, it would look like an upstart, an outsider, was gaining influence, cementing her place in the family he felt had been stolen from his own. The effect was immediate. The chill from the palace staff intensified. Ilara the nanny now looked at her with open hostility, and the guards' expressions grew even more guarded. They were Valerus's men, their loyalty to their captain first and foremost. Jordan felt their eyes on her constantly, a weight of silent judgment. She was utterly alone, save for the king and his children. She played her part, focusing on Matthias and Freya, letting her bond with them deepen and become her genuine armor against the hostility. She taught Freya how to bake cookies in the vast, gleaming palace kitchens, much to the horror of the royal chefs. She helped Matthias build a sprawling, intricate model city on the floor of his playroom, listening as he explained the strategic importance of every tower and wall. They were her truth in a world of lies. One evening, Theron joined them in the playroom. He watched as Jordan helped Matthias place a tiny flag on the highest tower of his model city. "This is the Citadel of the Dawn," Matthias explained to his father, his face serious. "It's impenetrable." Jordan said, "We need to reinforce the western wall, because it's a blind spot from the main watchtower." Theron looked at Jordan, one eyebrow raised in amusement. "You have a mind for military strategy. I have a mind for watching out for trouble," she corrected him, smiling. "In my neighborhood, you always had to know which alleys had escape routes." His amusement faded, replaced by that intense, searching look she was beginning to know so well. "You miss it. Your world." Jordan thought of the sticky tables, the 14-hour shifts, the bone-deep weariness. She thought of her lonely apartment, the rattling pipes, the constant struggle to make ends meet. "I miss the quiet," she admitted. "But I don't miss the loneliness." She looked at Matthias and Freya, who were now arguing good-naturedly over where to place the barracks. "I wasn't this tired then, but my heart was." The admission hung in the air between them, a fragile, honest thing. Before Theron could reply, a guard appeared at the door. "Your Majesty, Captain Valerus requests an urgent word." "Send him in," Theron said, his voice instantly regaining its regal authority. Valerus entered, his face a mask of grim duty. He bowed. "Your Majesty, we have found the location where the children were held." The atmosphere in the room went from warm and domestic to ice-cold in a heartbeat. Jordan instinctively moved closer to the children. "It is an abandoned warehouse in the industrial sector of the human city," Valerus reported. "My men are securing it now. There is evidence of dark magic. The signature is faint, but it is consistent with the one found at the breach." He paused. "It is the signature of your brother, Malachi." Theron went rigid. "That is not possible. Malachi is dead." "Perhaps," Valerus said, his voice carefully neutral. "Or perhaps his followers have found a way to harness his power. A cult. It would explain their motive, to steal the children and raise them in his twisted ideology, to finish what he started." It was a perfect explanation. It was plausible, it played on Theron's history and his grief, and it directed all suspicion away from the palace and toward a shadowy, external enemy. It was too perfect. "Jordan," Theron said, his voice tight. "Take the children to their rooms." Jordan nodded, herding the bewildered Matthias and Freya out of the playroom. But as she passed Valerus, her eyes met his. And for a fraction of a second, she saw a flicker of triumph in his gaze. He thought he was winning. He thought he had successfully thrown the scent off his own trail. Later that night, Theron came to her rooms. The fire was burning low, and the only light came from the moon streaming through the tall windows. "He is lying," Theron said, without preamble. He paced before the hearth like a caged panther. "Malachi's magic had a unique resonance. I would feel it if it were active again. This is a fabrication. A clever one, but a lie nonetheless. He's trying to create a ghost to distract you," Jordan said. "He wants you to chase shadows outside the palace walls so you stop looking for the traitor inside them. He's trying to close the case," Theron growled. "He will present this evidence to the council, declare the threat neutralized, and I will be seen as a fool if I continue to doubt him." He stopped pacing and looked at her, his face etched with frustration. "He is forcing my hand." "So what do we do?" she asked. "We need proof," he said. "Something concrete. Something that ties him directly to the kidnapping." He ran a hand through his dark hair. "There must be a record. A payment, a secret correspondence. Valerus is meticulous. He would not have undertaken such a risk without a network. He would have needed accomplices." "The footman," Jordan said suddenly. Theron looked at her. "What footman?" "I don't know his name. He's young, nervous. I've seen him, watching. He always seems to be near Valerus's offices. And he looks guilty." It was a pure hunch, a gut feeling based on 1,000 tiny observations she hadn't even realized she was making. Theron stared at her, his mind working. "A weak link," he murmured. "If Valerus has a conspirator inside the palace, it would be someone unassuming. Someone who could move about unnoticed." He straightened, a new resolve hardening his features. "I will have him watched." The trap was set. The next 2 days were a blur of tension. Jordan kept the children close, a constant, cheerful presence that belied the fear coiling in her stomach. Theron was a storm cloud of controlled fury, his interactions with Valerus a masterpiece of feigned trust and regal command. The break came on the 3rd night. A guard loyal only to Theron brought a message. The young footman, named Rhys, had been seen leaving a sealed message in a hidden drop point in the palace archives. The message had been intercepted. Theron summoned Jordan to his private study. It was a dark, masculine room, dominated by a massive desk and maps of his kingdom. He held a single piece of parchment in his hand. "It's a report," Theron said, his voice dangerously quiet. "From Rhys to a contact outside the palace. It details your schedule. Your habits. The children's routines." He looked up, and his eyes were blazing. "And it mentions a final payment to be made after the accident." The word hung in the air, cold and sharp. He wasn't just going to discredit me, Theron breathed, the realization dawning in all its horror. The cult of Malachi would be blamed for a tragic accident. A fire. A collapsed balcony. Something that would remove Jordan, and perhaps the children as well. Leaving the throne empty. Leaving the kingdom in chaos, in need of a strong, steady hand to guide it. Valerus, Jordan whispered, the name tasting like ash. He wasn't just trying to seize power. He was trying to erase Theron's entire line, a complete and total vengeance for his own lost legacy. "He will move tonight," Theron said, his voice a low growl. "The report mentions the southern balcony, off the conservatory. It's old, scheduled for repairs. A perfect place for a tragic collapse." He looked at Jordan, and for all his power, for all his rage, she saw fear in his eyes. Fear for her. "The children are with Alara," she said, her mind racing. "In their rooms. They're safe. For now," Theron said. He came around the desk, taking her hands in his. His were cold as stone. "Jordan. I will not let him harm you." "I know," she said, her voice steady. She looked into his eyes, and saw not a king, but the man who had knelt in her shabby apartment, his heart breaking with relief. "But we have to stop him. For good." The final act was a play, and they were all its actors. Theron, feigning ignorance, announced he would be in council meetings late into the night. Jordan, playing her part as the unsuspecting target, told Freya and Matthias she was going to the conservatory to pick some night-blooming jasmine, their favorite flower. She walked the long, silent corridors alone, her footsteps echoing on the marble. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. When she reached the conservatory, the air was warm and thick with the scent of damp earth and flowers. Moonlight streamed through the glass ceiling, illuminating the lush greenery in shades of silver and black. The doors to the southern balcony were open, a dark rectangle promising a cool breeze. She stepped out onto the stone balcony. The air was cool on her skin. Below, the palace gardens were a sea of shadows. She leaned against the balustrade, her heart hammering. It felt solid enough. Was she wrong? Had they miscalculated? A footstep behind her. She turned. It wasn't Valerus. It was the young footman, Rhys. His face was pale and slick with sweat in the moonlight. He was wringing his hands, his eyes wide with panic. "You shouldn't be here," he stammered. "It's not safe." "What's not safe, Rhys?" Jordan asked, her voice calm. "The balcony, the captain," he couldn't finish. He was just a boy, caught up in something far beyond his depth. "He's a traitor, Rhys," Jordan said softly. "He betrayed his king. And he's using you. Whatever he promised you, it's not worth this." Tears welled in the boy's eyes. He said the king was weak. That the true line had been broken. "He promised my family land, a title. And all you have to do is let me die." Jordan finished for him. From the shadows of the conservatory doorway, a new voice spoke, cold and sharp. "He has done his part. As have you." Valerus stepped onto the balcony. He was dressed in his immaculate captain's uniform, but his face was no longer a mask of control. It was twisted with a triumphant rage. In his hand, he held a dark, ornate rod. "A pity," he said, his eyes sweeping over Jordan with contempt. "The king has developed a fondness for strays. It is a weakness I must now correct. He raised the rod. It began to hum, a low, vibrating thrum of power that made the stone beneath Jordan's feet tremble. Cracks began to spider web across the balcony floor. "It was you," Jordan said, keeping his attention. "You let the kidnappers in. You faked the report about Malachi." Malachi was a fool, but his vision was pure, Valerus snarled. "This kingdom has grown soft, hiding in the shadows. Theron continues his father's cowardice. He even pollutes the bloodline with human sentiment," his eyes burned with a zealot's fire. "I will restore this kingdom to its proper glory. I will be the regent the people need." The balcony gave a violent lurch. A section of the balustrade crumbled, falling into the darkness below. Jordan stumbled back, her hand flying to the wall for support. Rhys cried out in terror, scrambling back into the conservatory. Valerus laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Goodbye, little waitress." He gave a final, powerful thrust with the rod. The stone beneath Jordan's feet groaned, and then gave way. For a heart-stopping second, she was falling, the night air rushing up to meet her. But she did not fall far. A hand shot out of the darkness and clamped around her wrist like a band of steel. She was jerked to a halt, dangling over the chasm where the balcony had been. She looked up into the furious, twilight eyes of the king. Theron had been waiting in the shadows of the conservatory. He hauled her up with effortless strength, pulling her into the safety of the doorway as the last of the balcony crashed into the garden below. Valerus stared, his face a mask of disbelief. "You are how? Did you really think I would leave her unprotected?" Theron's voice was a low, lethal snarl. He stepped forward, a figure of pure, undiluted fury. His guards, the ones loyal to him, emerged from the conservatory, surrounding the stunned and terrified Valerus. "You have underestimated me, Valerus," Theron said, his voice resonating with power. "But your gravest error was in underestimating her." Valerus looked from the king's wrathful face to Jordan, who stood, shaken but unharmed, at his side. He saw the truth then. He hadn't been outmaneuvered by a king's strategy. He had been undone by a waitress from a back alley. His perfect plan, his years of resentment and ambition, all of it had been brought down by the one person he had never even considered a threat. The look on his face was not fear. It was utter, soul-crushing defeat. And in the silent, moonlit conservatory, that was justice enough. The aftermath was quiet. There was no public trial, no grand execution. Valerus and his conspirators simply vanished. The official story, disseminated through the palace with quiet efficiency, was that the captain had been killed while heroically thwarting a final, desperate attack by the followers of Malachi. The lie was a necessary balm to soothe the kingdom, to prevent the schism a public betrayal would have caused. Theron understood the burdens of kingship, and sometimes, that meant burying the truth for the sake of peace. But within the palace walls, the truth settled, changing the atmosphere. The tension that had permeated the air for weeks dissipated, replaced by a sense of weary relief. The guards now looked at Jordan with a newfound, grudging respect. Ilara the nanny requested a transfer to a distant noble house. The palace's immune system had not rejected the foreign body, it had adapted, accepting her as a permanent part of its ecosystem. Jordan's life found a new, peaceful rhythm. The days were filled with the children. They were healing. The nightmares still came, but they were less frequent, their edges softened by the certainty of safety. They would call for Jordan, and for their father, and the two of them would sit with them in the dark, a silent, united front against the shadows. It was in these quiet moments, these shared vigils, that the space between Jordan and Theron began to change. The gratitude and respect that had defined their relationship slowly, imperceptibly, deepened into something else. It was in the way he would look at her across the dinner table as she made Freya laugh, a soft, wondering expression on his face. It was in the way she found herself listening for his footsteps in the corridor, her heart giving a small, traitorous leap when she heard them. One night, long after the children were asleep, they sat together in the library, a comfortable silence between them. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow on their faces. "They are happy," Theron said, breaking the silence. His voice was soft. "I have not seen them this at ease, this, full of light, since their mother died. It was the first time he had ever mentioned her. Jordan looked at him, waiting. She was fragile, he said, his gaze distant, lost in memory. A gentle soul. This world, this life, was too harsh for her. She was not a fighter. He turned his gaze to Jordan, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. You are the strongest person I have ever known. I'm not, she said, shaking her head. I'm a waitress. I got lucky. Luck has nothing to do with it, he countered, leaning forward slightly. From the moment I saw you, standing in that shabby little room with a piece of wood in your hands, ready to defy a king for the sake of 2 children you had just met. I knew. I saw the fire in you. He reached across the space between them, his fingers gently touching her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair. His touch was cool, but a jolt of warmth shot up her arm. My kingdom has walls of stone and an army of warriors, but its heart was undefended. Until you. Jordan's own heart was hammering against her ribs. This was more than gratitude. This was a confession, an admission of a need that went far beyond the safety of his children. Theron, she whispered, his name feeling both strange and intimately familiar on her tongue. I find, he continued, his voice a low murmur, his thumb stroking the back of her hand, that I am a selfish man. I brought you here for them. But I have come to realize that I need you for me. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them, to the warmth of the fire and the touch of his hand. All the reasons this was impossible. He was a king, she was a human, they were from different worlds, faded into insignificance. All that mattered was the truth she saw in his ancient, lonely eyes. The same loneliness she had carried in her own heart for so long. She didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she turned it over, lacing her fingers with his. It was an answer, a silent acceptance. He brought her hand to his lips, his kiss a soft, reverent press against her knuckles. Matthias asked me the other day if you were going to be their new mother, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. Jordan's breath hitched. What did you say? I told him that was a question I would have to ask you. He paused, the weight of his next words filling the vast library. And I would also have to ask if you would consider being my queen. It wasn't a proposal born of politics or duty. It was a question born of late-night conversations and shared fears, of mutual respect and a slowly blooming, impossible love. It was the quiet culmination of a journey that had started in a dark alley in the rain. Jordan looked at him, at this powerful, lonely king who was offering her not just a crown, but a family. A home. She thought of Matthias's solemn intelligence and Freya's sunny smile. She thought of her life before them, a grey existence of exhaustion and solitude. And she thought of the future stretching before her now, one filled with light and laughter and the fierce, protective love she had discovered within herself. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. Yes, she said, her voice clear and steady in the quiet room. Yes to all of it. The weeks that followed were not a whirlwind of ceremony, but a quiet, deliberate knitting together of a family. The formal announcement of their betrothal sent ripples through the kingdom, but Theron handled the political ramifications with a swift, unyielding authority that left no room for dissent. Jordan was his choice. She was the choice of the royal children. That was all that mattered. For Jordan, the true coronation was not the one that would eventually place a crown on her head. It was the small, everyday moments. It was Freya, crawling into her bed in the morning for a cuddle. It was Matthias, seeking her out to show her a new book he was reading, his initial reserve now completely replaced by an open, trusting affection. It was Theron, coming to her at the end of a long day, the weight of his kingdom falling away as he simply sat with her in silence, their hands intertwined. One crisp autumn afternoon, she found the 3 of them in the royal gardens. Theron was teaching Matthias the basics of swordplay with blunted wooden swords, his movements patient and precise. Freya was sitting on the grass, weaving a crown of fallen leaves, which she promptly placed on Jordan's head when she approached. "You're the Leaf Queen," Freya announced with a giggle. Jordan bowed dramatically. "I am honored, Your Highness." Theron and Matthias stopped their practice, both of them smiling. In that moment, bathed in the golden afternoon light, they were not a king, a prince, and a princess. They were just a father and his children, their faces bright with happiness. And she was with them. Theron walked over, his eyes soft as he looked at her, at the ridiculous, beautiful crown of red and gold leaves in her hair. "It suits you," he said, his voice low and full of a love that was now an easy, comfortable thing between them. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, gentle kiss that tasted of autumn air and forever. Matthias and Freya groaned in mock disgust, but they were smiling. This was their new normal. This was the shape of their family. Jordan leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the children chase each other across the manicured lawn. She had not been born to this life of castles and crowns. She had been forged for it, in a back alley, with a fierce heart and a promise to keep 2 children safe. She had come to the palace as a guardian, a shield. But she had become its heart, the warrior queen who had fought not with a sword, but with a love so fierce it had healed a broken family and saved a kingdom from itself. The storm had passed, and in its place, a quiet, sunlit peace had finally, blessedly, begun.